Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good news, and good feminist greetings to friends, colleagues, sisters, feminists across the world. I am so grateful and honored to be moderating this panel this day on a subject which is extremely close to my heart and extremely close to the hearts of the wonderful, fierce women who have kindly agreed to wake up at what is a relatively early hour for us this side of the world and discuss this further. So the logic for this panel is really around feminist memory and the reasons and the ways in which erasure continues to be an incredibly political act of unremembering, of dismantling and vandalizing our beings, particularly as women. I have a wonderful opportunity here to curate what I think and I know is going to be a very special conversation between four women whom I have a lot of love and respect for as well. I'm going to introduce our four speakers all in one, and then I'm going to turn the conversation out to each of them. So the first speaker that we have this morning is Danai Mupotsa. She's a senior lecturer in African literature at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. She specializes in gender and sexualities, Black intellectual traditions and histories, intimacy, affect, and feminist pedagogies. She's also a member of the editorial collective of Agenda and sits on the editorial board of the Brill series in youth culture. Her first collection of poetry called Feeling Ugly was published in 2018. And in fact, it has already been translated into one of our other favorite languages, Portuguese. You're very welcome, Danai. Our next speaker is going to be Gail Smith, who's a feminist writer and journalist. She's basically an all-round Renaissance woman. Her day job, she's the head of strategic communications and spokesperson at Soul City for the Soul City Institute for Social Justice, which is a well-respected formation in these neck of the woods. She's also a former spokesperson of the South African Human Rights Commission. She's worked at the City Press as a senior specialist writer. She was also the former head of the UNISA Institute for Gender Studies and was also the head of communications at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, known as MISTRA. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, she is a fierce feminist of long standing, and many of her essays focus on race, gender, feminism, culture, the commodification of Nelson Mandela, and very importantly on Winnie Mandela from an African feminist perspective. Our next wonderful woman is Ntabiseng Mtseme, who's currently the academic director at the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Her research interests include African feminist and feminist theories, African cultural production and subjectivities, townships and township women's shifting identities, truth and reconciliation commissions, and importantly for this discussion as well, women's memories, African spiritualities, and the meanings of death. She currently serves on the editorial boards of African Identities and Feminist Legal Studies. And last and never least, we have Sipokazi Magadla, who's a senior lecturer in the Political and International Studies Department at Rhodes University. Her PhD examined the state-assisted integration of women ex-combatants into civilian life in post-apartheid South Africa, which is a very strange place for many of us. Her more recent publications include Theorizing African Women and Girls in Combat, From National Liberation to the War on Terrorism in the Palgrave Handbook of African Women's Studies. You are all extremely welcome, my sisters and comrades in this movement. I'd like to turn the conversation immediately first to you, Danai, to make a few opening remarks and perhaps to take us through your thoughts on memory, your thoughts on living memory in the context perhaps even of the Fallist movement and other movements which have impacted you and your thinking in recent times.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely welcome. I didn't know you were going to ask me first, but I should have. I guess memory, I think, is, for me, a lot of what I've been thinking about is, in general, across things I think about it. I think, obviously stuck to memory is the question of intuition, and intuition being a kind of capacity to know that we often aren't, it's like empathy or feeling. Those aren't in general. Those aren't things we're tuned to know because of the ways that coloniality continues to function. So it's not just that we have a separation of the mind and a body and a mistrust of what our body tells us that we're tuned to do, to the point, you can be in pain in your body and ignore it because you don't even know how to recognize it. And because of a particular kind of preoccupation with certain forms of cognition, but that the kind of coloniality makes up this line of knowledge, this epistemic line. What is real knowledge? What does it mean to really know something? That means that our sense of who we are or our being is dissociative just from the start. And of course it's gendered because there's this kind of colonial sexual division of space and labor. So even the labor the body is doing in knowing the world and having a capacity to articulate its own sense of what is happening is denigrated to what becomes more authoritative, both as history, but I think also as memory, because memory, I think, strikes us as more intuitive because it's unreliable. It shows up, you can smell something and be sent somewhere else, whereas that opposes what the authoritative history of what has happened here is in place. But it's also still, because we're not tuning ourselves into that sense all the time, that there's a sense that also that question of being continues to, and being and knowing, I think, are just these dissociative things where we just sort of, it's, and I think that's because of these inheritances. So a lot of the ways that I've been wanting to think about memories, both how projects of memory have this capacity to expand and to enlarge what is the authoritative narrative, to open up those pockets of erasure. But there's also that because those muscles aren't always exercised, that there's always this way that capacity gets put back into like national times frame or into like things that we know already as, so these moments, these iconographic moments or ideas or ideals of even what our liberation feels like. And so that putting back in is both, I guess, a way to stay in time with the present, to not go mad. But of course, what it does is that it also, again, is rooted in that mistrust we have of the things that we actually do know that are possibly tied to a vocabulary freedom that we may not even be able to articulate because it might feel like a madness. I don't, that 7 o'clock in the morning, I say madness twice.
And just to pick up a bit more on exactly that, which is when you talk about how we stay in the present when in fact the present is often mitigated and mediated by what has been in the past, right? So cell memory, cognitive memory, as you rightly say, the memory of who we were and what we carry with us. What are the sort of, do we think that there are linear or non-linear ways to make the connections that can then help to excavate, rather than taking us to a place of sometimes maybe necessary madness, but to a place of necessary recollection, uncomfortable recollection, whether it's collective or individual? Is there a space for that,
Yeah,
Danai?
absolutely. I was at a show on the weekend and spontaneously people, someone with this incredible voice asked to sing. And I just, intuitively I took my shoes off to be grounded. And it's like the ground opened up and swelled into something. And there was a trance of, and it was trance-like. And I think that there are ways that people, through like daily ritual, through the fact that all of us are probably in forms of, we call it depression, mental health, because there's such a limited capacity for freedom in the present, even though we're told the present progresses linearly to something good and better. That thing in an essay when you're always like, well, things are pretty terrible, but they'll be better in the future. So there's that. So we have this notion of historical time when things progress and no real evidence of that truth, but we, of course, we would buy into it because how do you wake up every day? And but I think the forms of catharsis or the methods of survival and coping people make often, I think that we're seeing an increase in people in ritualized forms, and ritual time, of course, is not linear, it's circular. And I think that those graspings for just like, I need something, whether it's like, I'm going to do this every day in the morning just so that I can get up and get going, or when I'm in church singing with with other women, or that those moments that we would call, like, I guess, tactics for survival, but also they're tactics that unearth, I guess, systems, methods, forms of knowing that are otherwise, when you're doing the daily trug of work, going to work, come back home, the day-to-day circle of survival, that those things maybe aren't simply maybe coping things, but they also do the interruptions, right? That have that cathartic potential, but also maybe have the potential to animate a kind of a project of memory that is attached to freedom that we don't even know what it looks like yet.
I'm going to pick up on some of that later and file it. Thank you very much. The notions of repression and the pockets of authoritarianism, and also the forms of healing. And I think non-memory sometimes even as a form of survival, because maybe remembering is actually even more traumatic, but that's something to explore. I'm going to turn out to my dear sister, Gail, to pick up some of the same issues and also to maybe embed in some of the work that you've been doing as well. So take it away.
Sure. Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Hey, Denai, thanks for that. So I think with respect to feminist memory and erasure, I want to pick up on something which you said, Lebohand. You speak about uncomfortable recollection. And I think if you break down the word recollection, recollection, for me, it's about remembering, putting back. If you think of a member as a body, putting back the body, putting back the bodies of our past, bringing things back together in a different organization so that a different picture emerges. So for me, I also just want to jump off then on something Denai said about the ritualized nature of so much of these survival strategies. Yeah, she said that these are interruptions that have a cathartic potential, and it's a project of memory that is often powerful and empowering. And for me, that is exactly what happened then in the moment that Winnie Mandela dies, right? So that's the area where I am particularly interested in looking, in remembering, bringing back the bodies of the past together in a different way, as opposed to just a sort of mental remembering. So for me, I think the feminist project of memory and addressing the erasure is critical for all of us, because we are the ones who are most implicated in this erasure. And I think for me, that's what's really, really critically important. My own interest in this obviously does come from Winnie Mandela, from a certain discomfort of having had this person, this icon, as a totem for most of my life. And then suddenly having a national narrative, and I say national quite deliberately because there was a project of nationalism that was working as well. So suddenly this icon changes, and inside of me as a young Black feminist at a particular time of liberation, I'm suddenly thrust into this wilderness where I cannot claim my mother, where you cannot publicly say your mother's name, where you cannot publicly recognize your mother's contribution to this moment of liberation, because your mother has been discarded, disgraced, and essentially disempowered. So for me, that's where my interest in feminist memory really, really came from. It was at a moment in this country's history, a moment of liberation, but which was a moment of extreme silencing, and for me, seemed to be a moment of colossal national memory loss. And I was very interested in how women's contributions to change, how women's contributions to revolution then become undone in memory. Yeah, how they get erased. And I think that I was particularly interested not just in how we as a liberation movement or people who were liberated remember things, but I'm also interested in how the colonial settlers continue to remember things. And the erasure that has happened in the last 25 years has just been astonishing. But what we lose with that erasure is also a sense of the structural nature of so much of what we deal with today, that it's not for nothing that we are where we are as Black women, because Native women, as we were called, were cemented into the structure in a particular way, that it was a structural thing. And also, for me, I think what is lost if we don't do feminist memory projects is the fact that misogynoir was actually not only practice, it was legal, it was policy, and it was law. It was legislation. It wasn't just a feeling of not liking Native women or women of color. It was a systematic, state-sanctioned process where certain policies and laws were put into place to cement us into the structure, but then in terms of public discourse, speaking about us in particular ways, as if we were a danger. Firstly, we were a danger to white supremacy. Secondly, we were just riddled with diseases, right? So we became the site of all contagion. So then how that contagion moves through the eras, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then you see in the 90s how Winnie Mandela then becomes the ultimate totemic symbol of contagion of the dangers of Black women. And so for me, it comes back to what Danai was talking about. What is real knowledge, right? So much of the real knowledge, the common sense of South Africa today does need to be unpacked, not only to recover us from history, but for those who still hold power and who still sit on unearned privilege, to understand that the roots of their unearned privilege are tied to the shackles that still hold other people down today. That there is this, that apartheid essentially was not a beginning, but a continuation. And that it's very, very important for us to go back and to begin to understand where we fit into this puzzle, why we fit into this puzzle, and how what we are dealing with today is a continuation of the past. Otherwise, as Danai says, you do go mad. You do go mad. You know, you do have a tendency to think, well, this is just me. And I remember being 25 years old and sitting in a, cold, bleary London, writing this thesis before the internet, before there were all these resources available, and feeling mad, feeling I will never finish this. Why have I taken this on? This is a craziness. But 25 years later, really vivifying that young self and saying, that was an important process that needed to start. And I think for me, it shows in my own lifetime how long the project of recovery and recollection is one that goes on for a long time, but it is a necessary project.
Necessary and extremely draining, devastating, because it also offers the dangers of what we may find. And in excavation, one never knows as we're digging up where it's going to go, how far, how deeply does one have to go to find healing, if indeed there is actually healing, or whether there are greater crevices and cleavages that might even bring greater devastation. And that's the scary thing about remembering. And there's something else that I want to pick up on, Gailey, about how, Black women as the site of all contagion, and also as the site of everything sordid, hypersexualized, masculinized. I don't think I'm the only person who feels grated when certain people address me as mama. And there's a whole politic around that whole word mama, right? Black mama, and what it means and what it carries and what it conveys, as a form of, as almost as a servitude, as being desexualized, as being, dehumanized and so forth, and objectified in particular ways, in a very transactional way of addressing a person. But also that, the notion of privilege, usually white masculine privilege, is also the privilege to reconstruct, reconfigure, right? And to go through this excavation process in a way that, it's not even as banal as history belongs to the victors. It's deeper than that. It's a way of rewriting and re-inscripting, and not only for once, but for all time, and to continually move the goalposts in ways that continue to re-inscript and reinforce a pre-decided, narrowly defined form of memory, which is comfortable for some at the expense of many. So I thank you for that very much. Tabi Singh?
Morning.
Morning.
Morning, everyone. Morning, Lebohand. Morning, fellow colleagues, and everybody else who's watching. Should I scoot ahead, Lebohand?
Please scoot ahead.
What?
Pick it up where you will. I mean,
Sure.
the work you've also done around the TRC, the really important work that you've done around, well, all sorts of things. And if you want to thread in with what both Danai and Gail have also spoken of, you're welcome to do so.
All right, will do. Thank you. I wanted to, pick up on, I think there's a central thing that I'm picking up both from Danai and Gail, which is this whole notion of alternative knowledges and alternative memory sites. So through my work, as Lebohand has mentioned, working on women's memories of the violence in the 1980s, where I used Truth and Reconciliation Commission testimonies, analyzed what we would call working class women's narrations of past violence. And also what I did is I picked that up in my PhD work, where I looked at women's what I call lived and embodied suffering and healing in a township where I grew up in Chesterville, which is a small township. My mother still lives there. In fact, I was just there this weekend. I was telling Lebohand for a funeral. So embedded in that is when I analyze these memories, a concept that I came up with was something called alternative memory sites. And these alternative memory sites, basically, what I think they did is that they allowed us to unearth a feminist and a womanist ways of knowing. So a feminist and womanist epistemology. So they're very important in that way. And this, of course, epistemology, which is grounded in everyday life. And my interest was in poor and working class women. And what were their knowledge sites, and hence this notion of an alternative memory site then came up. This idea kind of opened up a floodgate for me in terms of just thinking through issues of memories, thinking through issues of women's ways of knowing, women's epistemologies, and in particular, as I say, poor and working class women's very much marginalized ways of knowing the world. Particularly, as I was saying earlier, under regimes of violence. What's of course very interesting is I found this. I recently was invited to be a panelist for a film at NMU. And the film that I was part of discussing was the Marikana Widows, which is called You Strike a Rock. And I was just taken aback by the similarity of themes that come up in that film, which is a feminist, I believe is a feminist film, around women's memories of violence. So you've got this continuity of women's memories of violence under apartheid and women's memories of violence under democracy, which was just striking. It was almost a mirror image of the two, just as an aside. But moving on to this concept of alternative memory site, which is really what I want to share this morning, is that it allows us, as I say, to kind of move into alternative knowledge, alternative ways, in alternative maternal knowledges, spaces which are grounded in the everyday lived experience. So they, here we talk, I think Danai has also spoken about body knowledges knowledges that reside in the body, that are based in flesh and blood. Knowledges, moral wisdom, what I call moral wisdom. A lot of this comes from, feminist, womanist writers who've been writing about these forms of marginalized alternative knowledges for some time. So moral wisdom, which is women's versions of their appraisal of what is right and wrong. So their versions of lived experience. Survival wisdom, very strong. This also comes out a lot from women's, when you start to chart women's alternative memories, which is what has been called a knowledge which is knowing how rather than knowing what. It is a knowledge that is about the convergence of emotions and analysis. I think Dana again also mentioned the centrality of the body and knowledge, intuition, when we're speaking about women's memories, and particularly in women's memories of violence. So basically, what women really force us to a place where we expand women's memories, where we expand our notions of knowledge itself, the knowledge they challenge at the heart, the very knowledge project itself, but also expand our notions of where memory lies. Where memory lies. They take us to what I call there's this sort of narrow and straight road, which is mainstream, which is hegemonic, which is, the hegemonic notions of memory. And they sort of take us on this path, this alternative path, to say, when you turn there, you're going to get a very different historiography of apartheid violence. You're going to get a very different picture of what it means to be human. So they take us to very deep questions of existential questions, questions around epistemology, and questions around feminist and womanist futures as well. And in this, they say, in a piece I wrote quite a few years ago, I say these alternative sites of knowledge force us to invest complex meanings in silence, in dreams, in prayers, in gestures, in tears, in sounds, in smells, in the flesh. It is these places oppressed women often house their memories and thus ground the meanings of their violating events. And of course, many studies have confirmed how it is often those who are marginalized and powerless who critique power using alternative means. And certainly women invite us to do this. I've actually used the notion, I've used the notion of diviners' ways of knowing, which is in fact one of the alternative memory sites that women take us to, which is looking at Africa, the centrality and the politics and the politicization of African spirituality, and how this can be quite a potent, political force for women under violence. So I've used the concept of what are, the diviner's way of knowing, which extracts meanings from dreams, from the body, from intuition, the senses, the lived world, the spiritual world, and kind of coherently constructs them as a form of situated knowledge, and which runs very much counter. So it really is responding to a notion of a decentered, a horizontal, and ambivalent way of knowledge, which is in radical conflict, as I say, to the Eurocentric notion, which is, of reason, which is vertical, centralized, and uniform. So women invite us to, really some of these critical aspects. And for me, I'm not going to go through the themes in details, but some of these alternative memory sites that in the work of the TRC work of women's memories of violent regimes, as well as the PhD, which was looking at everyday life in a township. These were some of the things. So women's memories spoke more rather than being nationalistic, as Gail has mentioned. A lot of the nationalist project, including the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Project, was a nationalist project. And so, sacrifice and very male-centric images were forefronted, but women subverted that in very interesting ways as well as that. And here's what they brought us to in terms of rethinking the past, rethinking the historiography of apartheid itself. And that was which was the whole issue of political violence and the violation of sanctuary spaces, the violation of the home, the attack of the African family structure by the state as a deliberate and intentional act as well. They take us to, the extent of the meanings of social mothering, political mothering, and in fact, we were talking about this whole concept of mama and its politicization, and how, in fact, some work, and maybe Spoggy will pick up on this. They did a brilliant seminar on this notion of motherhood early in the year, of how motherhood in an African concept can in fact become a radical practice. They take us to the violation of sacred spaces. By sacred spaces, I'm talking about the whole issue of death, the repeated experiences that women have to bear of death. They allow us to kind of, centralize it. And in fact, bring back, which I think is a debate we need to bring back, Lebohand, of the state culpability in Black deaths and women's roles in that. They bring us to, as I've mentioned, to the marginalization of African spiritualities, because this is very much a resource that women use as a way of excavating memories, a way of healing as well. They also bring us to the issue of land and spiritual displacement, that land is not just a physical, but a spiritual displacement. And they talk to this, the cry, the feeling of almost, the breaking of an umbilical cord of forced displacement, and how these have had an impact on African cosmological and women's central role in the spiritual, in the reproduction of the, the spiritual, as far as it engenders dignity for them. As well. So how violent displacement also is a spiritual displacement. They also bring us, they give us, more depth and knowledge and around understanding what I've called prayer and speeches of desire. A lot of poor and working class women pray central. It was so interesting. TRC, the notion comes up very strongly. In Marikana, the women, there's prayer. Before they start a political meeting, there's a prayer. Prayer is just sort of threaded all along. So I've called that women's speeches of design. We need to invest knowledge, in understanding that. The centrality of song, the centrality of adornment around ways of dignify as forms of constructing dignity. I'm almost done. Just two more themes that I wanted to mention is women's resistance. What I really enjoyed in when you start, and it also came up in the TRC and in the Marikana widows and narrations of violence, recent violence, was this whole, it took us on a journey on women's resistance and alternative political consciousness. That, political consciousness, which is normally male-centered, about the public, women's political consciousness is usually through the root of the everyday. It is usually rooted through dealing with the lack of material, poverty, living in a shack, running water in your house, having to feed the children, having to go and fetch water. It's rooted in all that political consciousness. So it is formed there. So they also take us through these processes that women go through. And of course, their ideas of reconciliation and healing. We get their versions through their lived experience as well. And again, so interesting when you then go into that, their versions through memories of the past is again through centers very much in the body, very much in these alternative forms of memory and yeah. And I think it goes something like this by I remember now the author, the feminist author, who says our journeys going forward as our futures will need to be grounded in our maternal ancestors. I jotted it somewhere. I'll find it later as we speak. But yeah, this idea that women's memories provide an alternative room to think through the past as well as the future. Thank you, Lebohand.
Thank you, Ntabi Singh. I would like to actually, and I'm aware that Gail also has time constraints, and before moving to Sipokazi, I'd like to sort of levitate slightly, and forgive me if this is a slightly non-linear way of facilitating, but there's so many things that strike as we're going along, and I'd love us to perhaps chew on some of these themes as well. So this notion of land as not only a physical space, but a space that holds memory. And I'm struck by that because I've been doing, as you know, Ntabi Singh, a lot of writing and publishing on that of late. And there's a concept that our good friend, brother friend, Tepo Madlingozi talks about, which is Ilizweli File, the land has died. So the land is also a spiritual being, a land has life as well. And we also derive life from it. Land also has the ability to be traumatized because of the displacement, and that, there's this kind of psycho-spiritual connection that we have. And also what you speak about around the centrality of song and the centrality of prayer. It's it's a call, it's a speech, it's a longing, it's almost a demand for something more, and a recollection of something that could have been better as well, and trying to evoke that and bring it into the current. And I'd love us to levitate on that. And Gail, I'd also love to go back to what you were talking about around a lot of the ways in which there's been a demonization of Black women, and also the sort of the putting back the pieces of the past, because I see these as somehow interwoven. So putting back the pieces on a physical space, but also on a into a psycho-spiritual space, and memory as non-linear, which seems to be the thread that's coming through. And I think, what would that look like, especially because women's bodies and the memory of women's bodies, including the embodiment of their struggles, are usually buried in dark places. There's the nomzamaization of memory, where they're turned into scarlet women. There's the virtuous women whom we want to be, whether it is we're told are the alternates, and this notion of almost setting up rivalries of the good woman and the bad woman. So you have an Albertina Sisulu, the wifely, virtuous woman, and then you have the Winnie Mandela, Nomzamo Madikizela, the scarlet, revolutionary, incendiary, and why it is that they're often played off against each other. And of course, not to mention the party politicization of women's memories and struggles across the world, right? Which is also linked with officialdom and very male-centric ways of remembering, which is to do with competitiveness, politics as a competitive sport, rather than as a transformative collective movement. It's a lot, sorry, more a comment than a question, but I don't know if somewhere in the midst of that, Gail, if you don't mind me sort of jumping back to you to perhaps chew a bit further on that, especially because you need to leave in the next while.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. And I'm sorry because I feel like I really want to hear from Sibokazi. But I think that the issue of memory being non-linear makes perfect sense, because if you think of the trauma and what that then creates, the gaps, the dislocations, if you think about the actual application of the 1913 Land Act, the violence that accompanies that, right? Boom, overnight, you are not allowed to keep cattle as a native man. So overnight, your cattle are literally taken by a white man because he legally can on the 16th of June, 1913. You think about, and the arrogance of that moment, the white supremacist arrogance of that moment then, even in that moment of dislocation, they were still issuing passes to natives to evict them. They were even giving them passes to evict them. So what happens then, the ways in which families and communities are ruptured, and when I say families, it's because Black families were constituted in a particular way, and Ntabiseng speaks about the violence that accompanied that opportunistic intrusion into native life, into Black life. So on the 16th of June, 1913 in Natal and in the Orange Free State, literally white farmers are burning down homesteads in order to drive natives off their land who don't want to work for free, essentially, right? So you think about the ruptures of those moments. That's why the memory is often not a linear thing, and there are large gaps. And so it is incumbent on all of us then to fill in those gaps. And I think if you just look at this moment now, the scholars that are here and the process in the last 25 years, that there has been this urgency. We are almost a leaderless movement of people who felt the sense of urgency to go back into memory, to plug the gaps, and to begin to understand why it is non-linear. I just want to briefly, if I may, there was a comment that somebody made about common sense and how do these things become common sense. And I think that for me, that is one of the most critical things we do need to address in South Africa. There's a lot of common sense we need to unpack in South Africa today. So white supremacy became part of common sense. Just like that, overnight, it became common sense. It became part of the parlance of everyday language. With that came a whole lot of other common sense. The notion of towns and cities as white men's towns, the sense that Native women could not enter into these towns. And the way that they kept them out was to create a common sense narrative about Native women being disease-ridden, licentious, a threat to law and order, a threat to stability. So these things then become common sense. And so much of what white South Africans in particular hold dear as common sense is mythology. There was no white South Africa at the end of the Boer War. There was no white South Africa. It was a construction and a creation that was made. And they still hold dear to this idea of themselves as this great nation who built them. No, they did not build themselves. State built them because it was in the interest to create whiteness in order to create a bulwark against blackness. And so when we go back into this and we start tearing the threads, what was real and what wasn't. As much as it is important for us to find ourselves, it is equally important for us to find the mythologies that were created to support the structures that held us down. White South Africans get very touchy when you remind them, actually, you lost the Anglo-Boer War. But more than that, at the end of the Anglo-Boer War, you were just a bunch of straggly people living in absolute abject poverty. And in fact, you deeply resented native farmers because they held the agricultural power in the country. And the 1913 Land Act was not just about land, but about breaking the back of our labor, right? So for me, this process is one that is ongoing, it's complete, it's very, very deep. And I think the non-linearity of it is really important. It's because where the chronology breaks is an indication that something happened there. So we remember 1913 for one thing and one thing only, the Land Act. And we remember the Land Act for one thing only, that they took our land. We don't look at the other aspects, which was about wanting to control the means of production and deny Native men and women access to cattle, because if you had a cow, you had the means of production. So there was much more embedded into that 1913 Land Act. And I really, really love the idea about land having memory and the land as a spiritual being, because I think that the most powerful, if you think back to how people are now talking about the land, like, was it Bishop Makhoba, I think, was talking about Makhoba's Kloof. For me, that was really, really powerful, because our names are inscribed in the land. And if we go back to the naming of the land, we find ourselves. And people are so obsessed about just getting back the land. Absolutely. But for me, there also has to be this visceral and spiritual recollection with what was taken when we lost our land, and what that meant, that moment for us as a people, beyond just taking our land, what they took from us in that moment. And also just to remember that 1913, there were two other critical issues for Black women that we need to remember. One was the 1913 Commission on Attacks on White Women, which was a significant commission in that it established a sort of common sense narrative of white women as these fragile creatures that needed protection, onto which white nationalism was then built on the backs of Black women. And the other thing was the 1913 anti-pass protests in Bloemfontein, and the violence that Black women brought to those protests, where they said, respectability politics be damned. And they fought pitched battles in the streets with white policemen who were clubbing them. And they knew that the chance they were taking was not just arrest, but that they would end up in a forced labor camp. Because of course, that was what, how they got Black workers. They just sent us to jail and then we were forced labor. So those women not only took the chance, but they actually, the violence with which they rejected passes, and the fact that they were united. It was Indian women, colored women, and Native women. It was the first time in this country that the natives as such had actually come together, and it was women who did that. So yeah, just to come back to this whole issue of the land and how we remember the land, and what seminal moments there are in relation to our land, are also seminal moments in relation to women. And we forget those seminal moments in 1913. It isn't just about it. I mean, taking our land was a huge thing, but they took so much more. And the intention was not just to take the land. It had a much broader intention And it really, as you know, as an economist, Lebohand, I think that, you know, it really set the tone for the political economy, both of the segregation state and of the apartheid state. Anyway, that's a bit of a ramble. Just to say, I'm happy to stay on another 15 minutes. I realize it was my bad, and I really want to hear from Sipokazi, so I'll be sticking around for a little bit longer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gail, for that. Yeah. And I want to just let me turn this out to Sipokazi before coming back to you, Ntabiseng. Again, nonlinear facilitation. I also have not had enough coffee this morning, but I'm just going with the energy as it's coming. And I have to say, I have to appreciate all of you, because this, maybe it's not tactful to say so, but this session is exceeding and expanding what I had conceptualized and what I had imagined. And I have to say, I thank you for the gift that you all are this morning. You're better than caffeine. Sipokazi, please go ahead, my sister.
Thank you very much, Lebohand. I'm very happy to be amongst these women and to be part of this very rich conversation. For me, you know, at the heart of feminist memory, I think in all disciplines, and one of the reasons that, well, the main reason that it is buried is because feminist work that is based on women's lives fundamentally challenges the founding myths, I think, of all disciplines. And so, for instance, I love that we keep going back to the, you know, what Madikizela Mandela means, for example, because in the story of the South African liberation, we are told, we're given this image that the war was between these men of the South African Defense Force and the men of MK in exile. And what Madikizela Mandela represents is the undoing of that, because for me, feminist memory allows us to ask, where are things happening? You know, who is participating in liberation struggles? Who is doing work? And so in this moment, we're asking ourselves about these definitions of what counts as work. So if we look at our own liberation struggles, it seems to me that a core part of feminist memories is the undoing of these ideas around the battlefront, the home front, the civilian, and the combatant. So when Madikizela Mandela says, in the township in Soweto, we were the cannon fodder, what she's claiming there is that the heart of the war was not just in Angola. It was not only in Tanzania or in Lusaka. It was in the homes, in the schools of Black South Africans where women are. And so that is part of why there is a pushback, because it says to us, to our history, it says to my discipline, how do we define a combatant? What counts as a combatant, and how do we define what war is? What counts as war? And that is something that our disciplines hold dear. So when I was working on my PhD, I found, you know, Miriam Makeba's song, Kauleza, and what she says there, when she says, I want to just read it. She says, Kauleza is a South African song. It comes from the townships, locations, reservations, whichever, near the cities of South Africa, where all the Black South Africans live. The children shout from the streets as they see the police cars coming to raid their homes for one thing or another. They say, Kauleza, Mama, which simply means, hurry up, Mama. Please, please don't let them catch you. And what Makeba is doing there is to say the war was at home. This is where the heart of the liberation was. And it also then allows us to avoid these false hierarchies where we then hold up the woman who was trained in Angola, the woman who was trained in Cuba, in the Soviet Union, as the combatant, as the symbol of the guerrilla. I think feminist work must allow us to say, yes, indeed she was, but in the majority, the combatants were in the country without training in South Africa. And even when women actually do go and train, it's still not enough. Because as Morrison says, there will always be one more thing for women to do, to prove. So Yuval Davis argued that part of feminists' enthusiasm for women's participation in what is known as direct combat was this idea that if women could prove to die for their countries, which they do all the time, then women could be much closer to achieving full citizenship. We know this from our record of women's contribution in the liberation struggle, that it is a lie. It is not true, in that you can have a person like Joyce Mujuru in Zimbabwe who shoots down a helicopter, who is a trained combatant in the most conventional way, if you will. But in the end, in a free Zimbabwe, this does not protect her from being called Ihure. So while someone like Grace Mugabe and Joyce Mujuru, we are told to think of them as two very different women, both of them can be called Ihure at any moment. So one has her struggle credentials and one enters politics in a way that is undermined, is patronized as someone's spouse, but at any point, those women can actually end up being made to be prostitutes. So for me, that is also the power of feminist work, is that it denies us these false hierarchies. And this is why I loved, Cynthia Enlow's work in feminist international relations, because she says, the wife of the soldier, the sex worker, the soldier who's a woman, all of these women are fundamental, are foundational to the war economy. When the South African government sends peacekeepers to the DRC, to Sudan for months on end, they are not assuming that any of those men, because most of them are still men, no one is assuming that those people are celibate. When the Americans, have occupied the Middle East for at least 2 decades now, none of us are assuming that those American men are celibate when they are in Iraq or in Afghanistan. There's an assumption about the access to women's bodies, just as Danai said. States take it for granted that women's bodies are there. And so for me, that is also then the power of feminist work, is that it denies us the comfort of venerating certain kinds of women, and also creating then these very false hierarchies. But what I also have appreciated in my work, and really Sister Tabi Seng's work has been so powerful, and quite a lot of my work really has been shaped by feminist sociologists, from Mutseme, from Jacqueline Koch, even Belinda Bozzoli, who recently passed, in that, their work, especially Mutseme's work, says what can be spoken at particular moments. So there's something interesting about the interview that Thandi Modise has with Jacqueline Koch in Colonels and Cadres, which came out in 91. Next year will be 30 years since this book came out. And there Modise, says we were, us women comrades and our male comrades, we were equal. In fact, the men made sure that, we were treated fairly. She says this in 91. And then in 2000, in an interview with Robin Kuno, she talks about the reality of the sexual harassment, the reality of the sexual violence within the camps. And I found Raymond Satner's attempt to make sense of what seems to be a discrepancy in Modise's narrative to be quite useful, because he says, of course, Thandi Modise in 1991, when the country is in transition, it would not have made sense for her to talk about, being sexually harassed by her comrades, because she still needed to negotiate with these men for a transition to democratic South Africa. And when they achieve that, then it becomes possible to talk about the fact that the same male comrades were also the harasser and the violators of women. And so I found that quite useful, what becomes speakable at what time, and so even when we talk about Fees Must Fall, I do believe that in terms of what actually happened in terms of the sexual violence, for instance, I don't think we've even begun to get into that conversation for for the academics, for the students who knew some of the things that were happening in the residencies, it seems to me that those might become speakable 10 or 20 years on. And so for me, then feminist memory also, pushes us to be patient, to say women, it's not because women are hiding things, they're always weighing what can be speakable and what often then the state remains unprepared to hear, to listen to. And so, of course, again, Muteme is the one who's propelled us to look at these alternative sites of memory. And I've really loved the fact that, there's been the re-release of this book, Malibongwe, which is a collection of poetry written by South African women in exile, thanks to Uhuru Palafala. And in this book, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that I interviewed two of the women in this book, Mam Belinda Martin, whose MK name was Gloria Mtungwa, and Alice Tsonga, whose real name was Dr. Pumza Gangi, was a former MEC of Health in the Eastern Cape, who passed away this Monday. And I want to finish my opening remarks by reading her poem, which again takes us back to the significance of what happened in 1913 and women's actions in 1913 and in 1956. So even in women's poetry, you see that they provide us a certain timeline to say, even though we mostly speak about the Land Act in 1913 and erase what women did in Bloemfontein, we count it. We count it as part of our chronology of women's actions, not just 1956, but 1913 and many other years. Of course, Makosaza Nakaba, who I also interviewed, provides a really compelling introduction to what it means for us to hold Malibongwe, which came out in the 1980s and was not accessible to South Africans until now. And so I'm going to just find, it is on page 86 by Alice Tsongo, Pumza Ganki, called Women Arise. She says, women of our land, and of course, land has been a key part of this discussion this morning. Women of our land arose, heard call of distant drums, summoning to unity, to war oppressive laws. 1913 call vibrated from eardrum to ear. They arose, those warrior women, and marched into the Free State. Eyes blazing, they hammered forward their path, and racists quivered. The women blazed nearer and nearer, forcing the final cowards to burn that violent law, their special restrictive permits of paper that arrested human movement. 40 years later, we were there, holding the fort, fiercely again women. Lillian and Helen, who followed Charlotte Maxeke, leading our women to apex. August 56, women arose, bathed in sweat. They marched, twos and threes of colors, coming and coming, torrents of defiance, to the very contaminated steps of Pretoria's Union building. They marched, petitions submitted, Straydom re-whitened, looked, then preferred to hide. What? His secretary lies, out of business. Bravery kept vigil, night transforming to triumph. How did their beings know? Police dogs were watching, waiting for the slightest move to jump against that victory. Mothers can march to battle. Women of Africa, arise. Thank you.
Thank you, Sipokazi.
Wow, Sipokazi, thank you.
So that was a tour de force. I mean, that was a,
Education.
Drop the mic moment there. Yeah, women of Africa arise indeed. These are the moments when it's a pity that one has to pull oneself back to oneself and actually facilitate the conversation. I would like to pick up on a couple of those threads, and thank you for bringing Cynthia Enlow into the conversation as well, Sipokazi, and the notion that we venerate a certain type of woman, the things that are also useful and political and strategic, the strategic silences. So what Thandi Modise I would call that a strategic silence that was in a particular moment, and not per se a form of being disingenuous. Of course, it's a circumstantial silence, right? One would also then ask about this notion of the access to full citizenship, and what it means then when women's bodies are not seen as worthy enough, even when we are willing to die. And as Gail has ably said, 1913 was one of the first and biggest. The anti-pass laws were one of the, long before the Durban riots, long before the men came into the picture. Women have been the ones, in fact, and it's not who have been leading not violent and non-violent forms of protest, not because we solicit violence, but because we are willing to do whatever is necessary, and laying down our bodies in ways that are very visceral and very sacrificial, right? That includes our labor, that includes our memory, and laying down our memory for the sake of masculinized, state-curated forms of recognition and remembrance. And this notion of then curated respectability that seems to flow through all of these themes. I would love to then point this back to some people as well in the session as well, who have a few comments. So Danai, while I'm scrolling here for some of the points, what would you say might be one of the tools for excavating the memory of women, the memory of those who have been before? Sipokazi speaks about, and of late, and I think in Tabi saying as well, fallism as a recent memory. But even there, where there have been these strategic silences, we're aware already of some of the contradictions that have already emerged from there, and the ways in which erasure has already happened, and it was happening in real time. More disturbing because it was happening as quickly as it was being created, as much as the events were being created. What might be some of the streams and the thoughts that you might have around that? And bear in mind, I'm not asking for solutions, but just a reflection.
Yeah, you have to forgive me because I had a whole bunch of things that I've been wanting to say, and so I will get there in a non-circle. But
say them. Yeah.
And I think coming back to this question, this original, I also immediately was, because then poetry came, was like grabbed a book as we were speaking about land. I just want to read something from Mangile Gancho's Red Cotton, and then speak to this question of kinship, and maybe come to how we speak. So Utata waits for me inside a drum. I cannot reach him until I peel him off the tractor blades, piece him together scattered on a maize field, carry him home in a wreath and broken string of white beads. Umakulu warned him against spitting calamine, playing too close to the river. She hid a drum inside a kist in the shed to protect him. I cannot reach it without red and white beads. Sometimes something has to be done. I feel this question of land for me, and this question of kinship, and I think a lot of the habits, those of us who, I think in general, once we enter the world, but also systems of education, is that the foundational assumption is that Black people don't have an interior life. And that habit is so explicit. It's not only that we are made to imagine they call it a universal audience, an imaginary white person who then we speak our experience to, but also that we actually don't, to learn the language of vocabulary of engaging a world where you're not in translation to this imaginary audience. It almost makes a kind of illegibility. And I think it's also connected to this question of interior life. It's not interior life in the kind of mommy, daddy, me, Freud psyche way, although that may be one capacity of the world that we carry as an interior life. But an interior life and this question of kinship, where it's not simply that the rupture, the making of separation of land and culture, where we end up as both nature itself, but also that we have to objectify something called nature in order for us to become human in a particular kind of way, means that even the vocabulary to think about, so the relationship to land is what I was thinking about. That kinship is not only that we are grounded as humans in it, but that actually the kinship of an ecological system, an ecology around which there is no human and there is no separation. And in fact, what that rupture does in terms of our capacity to hold our own ancestors is not simply where we place them, that we can't even find where some of our ancestors are. I don't know about yours, family, but I can only find 3 generations of mine. But it's also that even that the very notion of the person that where the relation to plant life is not one of conquest or cultivation or use value, but of medicine and of myself. And so the mineral wealth of the ground is the tree, is the water, is myself. That form of knowing that becomes an IKS or whatever kind of science field is tied, I think, to this question of interior life that is not completely hard to access, but I think it frames what is this question of what it means to speak and not speak. Because we don't know how to not, even if we're mumbled, like, part of me is like, there's many people speaking at once that are me and not me. But that capacity is so torn away from flag freedom that our capacity for speech is so constrained. And this question of then what can be said and not said and what's possible. And I think that I don't know if it's about what's not speakable, let's say in Fordist movements, for example, and what's speakable and not speakable is, I don't know if it's all contained in forms of secrecy that are strategic. I think sometimes, for me, at least for myself, to be in my body and to experience its pain it produces a form of incoherence the world cannot hold. So it is survival, but it also might be that my sense of what a form of justice or a form of being seen or recognized in the condition of the set of relations I'm in, I know the use value of my speech act, but it's not commensurate to the other forms of capacity or not capacity that may be possible in another form of relation that can maybe hold what sexual violence means, right? And so I think so much of what we understand around justice is so limited that I don't know if the use value of speech, short of its usefulness in animating particular kind of demands around justice, can hold what it means to ask someone to return to their body when their body has been the site of something that makes them mistrust themselves,
Thanks, Danai. And the question that I posed to you, can you possibly loop that in?
I was there with Fullest, but I was like, okay, you're asking people to, I was very obscure, sorry.
No.
No, and so, okay, let me be more specific and, I think that what happens in the height of, so people started narrating the end of Fallism in the middle of Fallism. And the need for narrative authority is a very, I think it matters to narrate something so that it becomes, because, first it's like, doesn't even matter, it's insignificant, it's some people who are annoying, and then you need to articulate something meaningful in order to allow political expedience to be, it's politically expedient. But the limits of narration is that it immediately constructs a particular kind of romance of a meaning of something. So we're looking for who are the leaders? What does this mean? What is the main objective? And I think that the desire to narrate, it's what it means from the very start, along with the expedience, also was already tying it into particular forms of memory and national time. People coming with cameras to make documentaries during the time. It's obscene. So I think it's so obscene already that I think that, so the things that were happening around, forms of sexual relation, violence, divisions of labor, you do this, there's part of like a conscientization. People are coming to an awakening of their own feminism, because it's like, why are you asking me to cook food? And then why are you touching my body? So of course people are animated to find a language to say, this is wrong, this is not just, this is the boundary of my body, and so people are finding language. And so there's all these moments, but also they're immediately being taken up into forms of speech action that are about something else and mobilized about something else. I don't know how safe that environment was or is in these kinds of contexts for me to make my experience available for speech acts that are above me always already. And I think that, I mean, all of these things, the fastness of people can, something is happening and people lifetime, right. And I'm like, I just don't think as fast as other people maybe. But there was such a quickness to explain everything, to cover everything, to have the full account, you can see every angle. And I think that the capacity to speak was contained within what's available in the very limited language we have already. The fact that we already are raised to not know when someone is violating the boundaries of your own integrity, your body, and your intuition is to not make them uncomfortable. We haven't even gotten to how do we talk about this thing that happened during Fees Must Fall, or how it was, so I know it's not a good answer, but yeah.
The perfect answer. And I think, I love that, because it loops also to what Sipokazi said around, sometimes we need to be a bit patient with memory, patient with the accounts, patient with deciding that things are definitive. And that's also to do with this authoritarian, statist, male narrative. Also want people who want to be the first to be on record, who want to be the ones who center themselves in the memory, who want to center themselves in history, even though it's happening in real time. And even though that history hasn't yet been proven, it takes time to prove history. And we are reimagining and reconceptualizing and debunking all the time. I'd like to turn this over to Intabi saying briefly as well. I'm not sure if there are any of the threads, in addition to the threads that you might have to follow up, but the things that you talked about, alternative maternal spaces, that mothering can be a radical political practice as well. And because I think I'm from a generation who thought different things around mothering and motherism as a form of struggle. It felt like a soft form of feminism, or the people who didn't want to call themselves feminist, motherism was sometimes seen as a counterpart, rightly or wrongly, I must say. And I'd be interested to hear around that. And I think state culpability in the violence against women and the ongoing violences and violations on women's body, again, very crudely and narrowly called GBV. But I think that there's a much deeper, gender-based violence and violence against women's bodies, whether it's intimate partner, has a much stronger historical lineage. It's a much stronger psycho-spiritual lineage, and there are deeper things that it's telling us that we're afraid to go to, that perhaps we might want to explore. Ntabi Singh?
Thank you, Lebohand. I just want to, before I dive into some of those, to link on what Danai was talking about earlier and what Spogazi, the notion of patience. One of the things when I was looking at, memories, violent memories of women, was what struck me in South Africa is straight after sort of kind of waking up from the nightmare where we're expected to speak. And when you look at, for example, when I was, looking at works on memory, I looked at slave narratives, I looked at memory in South American, authoritarian regimes, Holocaust memories. I looked at memories around World War II, memories around, as well as the India-Pakistan partition and women's memories of that partition. And fascinatingly, most of the work appears almost, 30 to 40 years later. People are allowed to be and kind of, internalize and kind of be embodied in the state of trauma and terror and work themselves out of that. But South Africa, there's a certain there's a certain way in which we've been expected to be able to verbalize our pain immediately without that space. So I just wanted to pick up on that, and that it's a really, I think it's an issue we need to really think through as women as well. Just returning, I wanted to pick up on a point you made earlier on the land holds memory, and just also talk to that. And for me, of course, it's this whole idea on picking up of what constitutes legitimate memory, what I call alternative memory sensory sites. And the century I put the intention, in fact, the century I've just recently inserted in these memory sites, I've called them memory centers, because in the way women memorialize, there's a sense in which they invite the emotional, they invite the feeling aspect to be activated. Let me put it this way. Yeah, to be activated when we talk about memory. So we don't think of it as an intellectual, something just a head issue, but something that is housed in the body and generates, a feeling, a sensory feeling of some sort. And one of the things, one of the women, what they also point to with the land, with the idea of land holding memory, is when I was interviewing one of the women, she says, "Wozala in Zulu means, come, wozobona, come and see." And then she points out this is and now we're sitting in a two-roomed home, a part of the RDP housing scheme, post-democracy, for those to give concept. A lot of two-roomed houses were built for people without housing. So we're sitting in a two beautiful house, all the doilies and remember those ceramic dogs polished, and we're having a conversation. And then she says to me, "Look, look outside." I go and look. She says, "Do you see the blood? Bonikazi." I'm looking. My PhD eyes are not seeing all of these. The third eye, as feminists will call it. And of course, what she's talking to is, and then I explored this idea of bloody landscapes. And this, it's this idea that land holds memory. Land is both physical and spiritual, which in fact is very much, all of these very much replicating, African, ideas of cosmology, of spirituality, of the material and the spiritual are all one. They're not these separated things that we've come to think through. So land is thought through in that way as well. And so what that invites us is this idea of purging. She then says there's a need to purge the old blood. There's a need of reversal. There's a need to heal the land. Basically, that's where that is going. So the other interesting thing that comes out of land as spiritual, land as holding memory, is the extent in which women's memories touch on this whole land ancestral connection, and how expanding on this idea of state culpability. I think for me, women's narratives, women's alternative memory centricide invite us to the space where we have to expand this notion of state culpability in under regimes of terror, because they say I was violated in my land ancestral disconnection, which was violently kind of broken. I suffered a violation. And we don't speak of that as a violation. So, and what I also found really powerful, in that, and this idea comes behind that, when people were forcibly moved, they didn't have the time or the resources, the means to do the proper rituals or that they needed to do to inform the ancestors that we were going, etc. And so what comes then behind that notion is a notion that the physical and the spiritual have been disconnected. And so in an African cosmological sense, there's a disconnect, and hence why there's instability. These were women, some women I spoke to, their versions of the continued traumas that are being experienced. But what I think was also powerful in terms of these alternative memory centricides is that I think they really hold it something for the world globally to contribute, especially given where we are. They give a very holistic idea of healing, especially healing post-trauma, protracted violence, which deals with the individual, it deals with the family, with the community, and it deals with the what I would call the sort of the configuration of intergenerational cords. So women have been responsible generally for that healing. So all of those things come up. I saw a comment by Saridzai, where she says, it is true that violent colonized invaded not only our land, but trampled on our shrines physically and spiritually. And Sarita, I just want to say, again, women take us here, because in their narrations of the constancy of death and having to deal constantly with death, one of the things I was shocked at when I was writing up the PhD is I couldn't, it was alarming to me that in social studies, you could read volumes of, that could fill this room, but the notion of death was not centralized. And this was a central experience if you were Black living in the ghettos or wherever you were living. So they take us there of living under the constancy of death and the dead. And this idea of, that we might, you say we are trampling on the shrines physically and spiritually, and that we may be trampling then on our own grief. This is something Jackie Alexander talks about, which I found so powerfully. She says we are literally, in not addressing it, which women bring up in their narratives, we are literally trampling on our grief as well. And so I think, this issue of death for me is a really important one, because it brings up issues not only of African cosmology and notions of the person, because the person is tied to the spiritual. So when there's a violation of that disconnect, that ancestral break, land, ancestral collection, being ancestral collection, there's a violation to self and the notion of who I am. This is an existential question, existential almost, a crisis. So it's not only, speaking to that, but it's also speaking to the violations of the dead. Again, back to state culpability that you were talking about, and extending that notion that the state was involved in the hiding, in the burning of bodies, of Black bodies. And so what's being done about that? On the violation of grave sites, burial sites, etc. And so women, I think also bring us to questions around, for me, why is the word run away from me? I want to say paying back, reparations. That's the word I'm looking for. Women bring that question back. What do we mean by reparations? We often talk of reparations as monetary. If all the state was involved in all, in all of these things, and we're extending that there was a deliberate project by the state to attack the socio-cultural resources of families and all of these other things that are linked to the spirituality of being. What are reparations in that context? I think it's time we need to bring that back onto the table as well. I think the final issue, I'm just looking, you're asking on the excavation, how to excavate these alternative memories. And of course, in the way that I have it, it's been through poor women's recollections of past violence, women's oral histories of the living under democracies and the violences of poverty, etc. But of course, it is also through song. I used a lot of alternative methodology, which is through song, which through poems, which Spogazi has done for us this morning, and as well as Danai. It's through song, it's through prayer, and it's through adornment. Look at us this morning. It's through adornment. African women have used this as a vehicle to critique power, to speak back, and many memories are housed in adornment as well. So in the body, etc. So, and these are also the places where we also, very importantly, we reclaim our humanity. It's a humanization process. And I think, as I've been, emphasizing, is that I think, again, as Jackie Alexander said, is that the person is not only political. A lot of feminists and womanists, the spiritual, we hide in a spiritual closet. It's time to come out of it. And she says, the spiritual is political as well. And we need to bring that back into the conversation. Thank you.
The spiritual is indeed political. Thanks, Ntagi Singh. This is a mesmerizing session, as many of us are saying here. I'd like to turn over to Sipokazi to make any remark about anything you feel like, but especially around the notion of the different forms of combat and the ways in which we don't valorize women's contributions because it's the stuff that women do. I'm of the view that there's nothing invalid about cooking as a form of combat, as a form of, as to sustain and to nourish. It was, having grown up in a struggle home and seen the different layers of contribution, which were gendered and so forth, and also appreciating that it's a false binary. I'd be interested to hear about that. And then sadly for us, you will be you'll have the final word, Sipokazi, so take it away.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lebohand. With the question of combat, I think, when I was doing my research, I also had a very specific idea of what a combatant was. And it was really, for a year when I was developing my proposal, I observed these life histories that Janet Cherry and Teresa Enderman were doing at KwaZakhele with former self-defense unit, Amabuto. And there you had, so Cherry's PhD was on KwaZakhele and civic movements in PE and in Port Elizabeth. And there, in the recollections of the men and women, I realized when one woman said, for a long time I couldn't eat meat. I couldn't eat meat because I'd seen too many people being blown up in front of me. And that really made me to think, if I were to fixate on the Mtizos of this world, on the Tabas of this world, the Yankees, I would actually miss the majority of the women combatants in South Africa. And so that's one part of it. But even when, women do train, and so another story that I think needs to be told is Memela Kambula's role in Operation Vula, for instance. So she is the one who did what they call reconnaissance. So when Siphiwe Nyanda and Maharaj were to come into South Africa from Swaziland for the last operation of Mkondo Wesizwe, she is the one who mapped out every step of what they needed to do to get into South Africa safely. But when that story of Vula is told, we don't talk about Memela Kambula, we actually talk about Maharaj and Siphiwe Nyanda. So it is those tensions of what is recognized in terms of, part of the story of the so-called young lions of the 1980s is that we talk about the young lions. We don't talk about the fact that a lot of them trusted certain mothers in the various townships in this country. So one elder in KwaZakhele, again, she said for, I think, 2 years, she couldn't sleep in her bed. She had to sleep on the floor because she was also a neighbor to a police officer who knew that she was hiding young men in her house. And so sometimes bullets would come through. And I said, oh, but she would not define herself as a combatant either. But in my view, she was at the heart of the war. So for me, the work is continuous, very much continuous. And I loved what Danai said about what is speakable, even about Fees Must Fall, because I remember, one of the things, that Gola clarified for me in Rape a South African Nightmare is that in democratic South Africa, we invite women to speak about their experience of violation, but the public actually has no obligation to listen. And so it is true, so for me, that was very striking that, so what is the point if I know that in fact I will be re-traumatized if I do actually speak, which is the case when women do break their silence. But the final thing, when Sister says one of the women's mothers said to her, "Do you see the blood?" It reminded me of Makhosazana Xaba's poem. She is a poet and a writer of short stories and a former combatant. She has a poem called After the Massacre, and I would like that to be my last word. I'll just read it for us. That after the massacre, after the bodies had been identified, counted, and taken away, after the police had come and gone, the neighbors stuck around. 4 women walked the familiar path in a single file, paraffin lamps in their hands. The stars listened to their hushed cries, watched them wipe away silent tears. Mechanically, they filled their water buckets from the homestead tank. Back at home, rags and soap from the cupboards, they started cleaning, first sweeping shards of glass scattered in every room, then wiping splashes of blood on walls and broken windows, smeared across the furniture, doors, sometimes even spotting the ceiling. In the kitchen, they removed pieces of brain tissue splattered in all directions. When they went on their knees to clean the floors, cupping congealed blood in their hands, they told the girls to look away, instructed them to comfort younger children, sing them lullabies until they sleep. They put in a bowl all the cartridges and bullets they found. In the bedrooms, they stripped the blood-stained bed covers and curtains, soaked everything in large zinc cubes for washing the next day. They went into each room, repositioned everything until the homestead looked almost exactly as it did before the massacre. By sunrise, the women had restored the homestead, but images of bodies that were identified, counted, and taken away linger years later in the women's hearts and heads. In their hands, they still see blood, broken glasses, and brain tissue. Thank you.
Thank you all. There's nothing further to be said. And I would just like to salute, to hold the space, to appreciate each of you. Thank you to Danai. Thank you to Gail. Thank you to Ntabiseng. Thank you to Sipogazi for the work that you're doing, the contributions that you're making. And thank you to all of us who woke up. For some of us, Amina, I think it's like the middle of the night for you. So that's super, super committed. Thank you so much. Yeah. So we're going to close off with a poem from another good sister of ours, Natalia Mulibadzi, which I believe is going to be played. And I'm sorry to folks where we didn't get to the questions and to the comments. And I know that you'll appreciate that it was just going with the flow of this very special session, and that we can always go back and reflect on them. And I think the need for a feminist memory project is absolutely necessary. It's an imperative. It's our collective homework going forward.
In this body, on this stage, stands a multifaceted, multi-use character. What do you see? What do you want to see? Sometimes lady, sometimes warrior, or is it savage? I said warrior. Sometimes freak. Sometimes ghetto bitch. Sometimes all of the above. Which do you see? Which do you want to see? Who do you see? Who do you want to see?
Sinamandla nase ezinsukwini zokufa. Oh sinamandla.
What do you call a woman who carries an entire world on her head? Black women save the world. Black woman saves the world, caresses it when no one is paying attention.
Sinjenge zinja kodwa thina sinjenga majuba.
My grandmother straddled opposing philosophies, embodied ideologies made to silence her. She makes a language out of the mess of colonial subjugation, made a song, made soul food, made healing potions out of genetic melodies, made a language out of the mess of colonial subjugation, out of survival, not choice. Every day this world tries to murder you. Every day they will stuff a language of subjugation down your throat. She wears a world that refuses to fit her dreams and freedoms. She ties the promise of a nation around her waist. The promise tries to blind her truth. The nation is a noose. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Inside the house of memory, she hides her stories. They all carry secrets, desires, dreams, histories, languages never explored, maladies never exposed. Memory is talisman. The woman finds home in herself. The woman is a home for herself, has always been. I come back here to the memory of things, the direction of things, the politic of things, the questions of it all, the aspiration of it all.
And thank you to all of us. Have a good day. We're going to continue for many more sessions. Please check South Feminist Futures Festival.org for the full lineup. They are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful themes that we can all plug into over the next few days. In fact, we've got a couple of more days. The theme for today is a knowledge base for South feminist activists. So I invite us all to continue on this journey. Thank you again. Humbled and blessed. Bye-bye.